On that note, I'd like to invite our keynote speaker, Ms. Megan Epler Wood, who's traveled a long way to be with us here this morning. Ms. Wood is the director of the International Sustainable Tourism Initiative, Center for Health and the Global Environment, Tien Chan School of Public Health, Harvard University. So today she's going to reflect on why a global effort is needed to marshal resources to manage tourism responsibly over the next decade. And drawing from her 2017 book, Sustainable Tourism on a Finite Planet and Modern Science-Based Systems and Technology, she'll share her vision for policy as well as destination management. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Ms. Megan Epler Wood.
Thank you all. Thank you to the Outlook Group for having me here and the responsible tourism coordinators who have been my bulwark throughout the journey coming here. It's a great honor to come and keynote your event, and I look forward to talking to you about the tremendous opportunities that exist in responsible tourism and the many with opportunity comes danger, as we all know, and some perilous journeys that we need to take together in order to ensure that all of our beautiful places around the world are properly protected as we continue to build more and more tourism for those. So I'm going to talk about the future of tourism. It is based on the research that we've been doing at Harvard for about 8 years. I've been teaching at Harvard for 8 years, and I've had over 300 students doing projects to look at destinations around the world. Most of my students study online. We have an open education system that allows people to study at home from wherever they are, and that enables us, of course, to then allow students to do research in their own home destinations. And that has led to an enormous amount of surprising new data about what is happening with the growth of tourism around the world, which I would call the future of tourism. So just to open up, I wanted to have us all reflect after this beautiful music and the opportunity to just think and reflect a little bit about what is responsible tourism. Has it actually improved human life? I've been working in responsible tourism and previously also ecotourism, sustainable tourism for over almost 30 years now. And what we've seen over time is that it has both of these qualities, both to help human life, improve human life, have the betterment of conditions around the world, while at the same time sometimes threatening all of those qualities for people. How do you manage this? It's been a 30-year quest for me, and I hope for all of you. It is also a question of environmental values. I see a lot of interest now in wildlife tourism already expressed here. That's very dear to my heart. I'm a biologist originally. So I think it is a wonderful opportunity for people to get out and experience the environment, but at the same time, there's this threat of overpopulating these areas with tourists. In my own experience, I've seen absolutely beautiful examples of sustainable and responsible tourism. This is a place called Copawi. It's in the Ecuadorian Amazon. It was started by some pioneers in ecotourism 25 years ago who had originally been working in the Galapagos Islands, and they partnered with an indigenous group called the Ashwar and created a completely off-the-grid solar resort that still operates to this day in partnership with those indigenous people. It has led to greater well-being and a wonderful sense of their own culture being very important. In Asia, I've had the opportunity to work with, some of you may know Albert Teo, a pioneer in our field in Malaysia. In Sabah, he's led an incredible movement to have Malaysians appreciate their natural history. These wonderful bridges across beautiful valleys were created in Malaysia originally in order to observe wildlife in the rainforest. I had the wonderful opportunity about 10 years ago to work in Sri Lanka with the USAID at that time, working in the Sinaraja Reserve, for those of you that have been there, and created the opportunity for investors in Sri Lanka with matching from the USAID to create the lodge that you see at the bottom. I worked with all Sri Lankan experts on biodiversity, some of the best biodiversity experts in the world, I must say, and also people involved in Sri Lanka with investment, where we raised $2 million through investment to create this rainforest lodge. We did social and environmental accounting and set a framework for an absolutely wonderful rainforest lodge experience, which actually I haven't gotten to visit yet. So I was there from the beginning, but have not been able to return to see it. And then more recently, I worked in the Western Hemisphere with communities in a previously war-torn country, El Salvador, which actually has amazing coffee farms and beautiful biodiversity in that region that is combined with coffee, so that you have some of the greatest bird populations in the country actually found on the coffee farms. It's a wonderful experience to visit them. And we worked with a below the poverty line cooperative that was growing coffee to create this tourism adventure trail with all of these outlooks that were designed by El Salvadoran architects to create a trail down to this incredible crater lake where people could visit just from San Salvador. And one of the things that I've experienced in my work in this field is how much tourism has become local. It's not just internationals anymore. It's regional, intra-regional, and domestic that is becoming increasingly important. And this project was entirely and is a very successful project for these local people. They also have a restaurant for domestic tourism. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about where are we going now? What is the future? What are we seeing by way of trends? And how are we going to manage those trends in the future? As we all know, tourism is growing rapidly. This is a very, very popular and well-done chart that basically looks at the trends for growth in the next 20 years. And as we've already heard, much of that growth will be taking place in Asia and Pacific. So you are really, and I'm so happy to be here, at the epicenter of this phenomenon of growth. It's going to continue by all expectations for 20, 30 years or more. We really can't project beyond that. And so therefore, that will come with certain obligations. Again, just to reinforce that trend, the actual level of growth in the emerging economies, the so-called BRIC economies, is much higher now than it is in, say, Europe or the Americas. So we're going to see a tremendous amount of new, both opportunities, but also a certain number of threats. And one of the things I always like to point out to my audiences is that our UNWTO statistics that I just presented are strictly international statistics. So all of the growth trends and statistics I just presented to you are for people that are traveling across borders. Now that does not include domestic tourism. And when you're talking about how do we manage destinations, you have to include domestic numbers. Those aren't published in any one place. Even to create these, I had to comb through a lot of pretty inaccessible documentation, to be frank, from domestic tourism agencies in order to come up with what might be the combined volume for, say, China, US, and France. Now, you may have all heard that France is the #1 tourism destination in the world. Well, you take a look at it. Is it? Okay, so given that, what I like to point out is that there's going to be a tremendous new amount of responsibility and thought required to how to create well-being in local areas. That includes the local populations. All of these tourists require services. And when you get into emerging economies, we have something that is internationally known as the infrastructure gap. In other words, local people are frequently living with infrastructure that is not the same as urban infrastructure, right? And that includes power, water, and waste, as well as wastewater. So when tourists arrive in these wonderful, beautiful regional places, local places, frequently the same services aren't there. Now, we take that for granted. That's fine when it's small-scale tourism, not a problem. When it becomes larger scale, this becomes a problem. And this is what my students were reporting on, was the emerging problem. So the burden on local destinations with the combined domestic and international growth is basically not being documented anywhere in the world. And so my students actually have performed some of that service for us and did all of these papers to look at the burden on local destinations around the world. And that is really the subject of it was the inspiration, I should say, to write a book. I don't write a book to talk about the past. I want to think about the future. And what this information gave me was the motivation to reflect even further. So let's just take one very well-known example in this region, Angkor Wat. I went there in 1995. I took this picture myself at sunrise. I could use some water if anybody. And it's obviously a wonderful experience to do that, and I'm sure many of you have. But what has changed just in the last 12 years is more and more people, of course, have actually been visiting Angkor Wat, to the point where this is actually what it looks like at sunrise when people are taking a photo at Angkor Wat. So we're seeing what these hubs of tourism, these must-sees, these places that everyone needs to go to, like Angkor Wat, becoming under what I would call enormous pressure. Now, I went to Angkor Wat on behalf of the World Bank IFC to study responsible tourism, thank you so much, and look at how much could hotels actually assist with this problem of managing the volume of tourism. Responsible hotels, I did a lot of interviews. What I found was that they were somewhat helpless to assist, actually, when it comes to this problem of volume. In Siem Reap, they have worked on this since. They didn't have any sewage treatment. It was a relatively small town before this volume arrived. So the Siem Reap River had become one of the most polluted rivers in all of Cambodia. Why? Because there was no sewage treatment for any of the hotels in Siem Reap. Ultimately, the Japanese Development Corporation came in and helped with the construction, but there are still many other problems. For example, this solid waste. This is in Siem Reap. It was taken by a Reuters photographer, and this is a young woman. All of us have seen this kind of thing, but she was living off of the waste of tourists. So clearly, this is a kind of phenomenon that we care about, all of you, with responsible tourism. It's a question for Harvard as well. I work at the School of Public Health. Some people ask me why. Well, because tourism is becoming a public health hazard, actually. It is generating public health situations that need solutions. So what's happening? So as I said, I was inspired by my own students to look at this problem and then look at, well, what are some of the explanations and then what are some of the solutions? So here are some of the explanations. We all know that the tourism economy is operating on an increasingly digital scale. All of you are aware of that. I myself enjoy this phenomenon. I can look at TripAdvisor. Last night I booked an extra night at JFK from my room in the middle of the night because I realized that I needed another night before I went on to my next destination. I think it's a wonderful thing. But what's happening is something very interesting that we in the United States and around the world, I think, could benefit from more research on, which is how this digital phenomenon is leading to a lowering of the overall overhead at each part of the supply chain. As we all know, these booking engines take a pretty big take out of the overall supply chain. And what is happening now is that when by the time you get to the bottom, which I call the destination, you're seeing actually that slice coming out of the revenue that could go to the destination. This is a very well documented, but not adequately researched phenomenon. So what we believe is the problem is that, and we will be facing this for the next 20, 30 years, is that we are going to be undervaluing our products. We have this digital supply chain that it's cutting overheads. We have destinations, as we all know, that are really dying to get tourists, and they're willing to do almost anything to get tourists. And so what do? They offer tax subsidies in order to attract foreign investment. We have what are known as common pool resources, which is essentially those beautiful shared resources such as beaches, coral reefs, even monuments that are struggling to have any budget. I've worked in the protected area community my whole career. I sit on a very large international committee for the IUCN, which looks at nothing but how do we drive tourism revenue in a responsible way towards our parks and protected areas. I can assure you it's an emergency globally. None of our parks and protected areas have enough revenue to deal with the volume of tourists that are coming in. And so therefore they can't do a good job. They don't have the revenue. 80% of our tourism tax, which I want to study much more in future, but roughly based on some very good research, is going not to the protection of our destinations, but to the promotion of our destinations. And our local costs, in the end, our local regional managers, I had a wonderful conversation yesterday evening with some members of your community from the Kerala area, where you're seeing all kinds of promotions, but not adequate thought into things like waste treatment. Okay, so what are the basic building blocks? Now, all right, that's the problem, right? Now let's look at, well, where do we go? How do we find a solution? And of course, as a professor, I couldn't at least leave out one point here, which is we have to have these basic building blocks to measure sustainability. We've all, as a community, I believe, struggled with how do we know what is responsible? How do we know what is sustainable? And even though there's been hundreds, if not thousands of projects on this topic, we still haven't ultimately come up with a system that everyone agrees on. This is now a serious problem, but I think we can all agree on certain principles. And the way that I am re-envisioning this, together with my colleagues at both Harvard and Cornell University, is to use some of the work that's been done in the responsible tourism community to look at all of these factors as capital that we need to preserve and invest in. So here's the difficulty to being re-expressed. We are not including the cost for the building blocks of sustainable tourism in the product. The product is actually our destinations, all right? Those are publicly owned for the most part, except for the private buildings around them, right? And people are coming in assuming everything is fine, even if they say they want to be responsible. There's plenty of research to show that they have no idea, of course, what's happening at the local level with tax systems and reinvestment in protected areas. They just try and pick a responsible place. So what we see is that with this cross-border international digital phenomenon is that people essentially are unable to judge how much of their money is going to the destination, and in fact, the reality is not enough. So what's really happening here? We have a growth industry that is dedicated to getting you to the place without enough investment in the place. And that's really, if you think about it, what the tourism industry is all about. It is about the business of marketing tourism. And I just give this one example. It's so classic. Phuket, a wonderful place, well known as one of the rapidly growing tourism destinations in Asia. This is their picture of what Phuket looks like in their marketing materials. This is what Phuket actually looks like now. And of course, they don't show that. So the reality is that we're creating a dream without making sure that the dream is fulfilled. So what is the alternative? Just one example of many in the world that's been documented is that we have to create a value-added tourism economy that invests in the destination. And Botswana has done a good job with this. They started once in the mid-90s when we saw that huge change with Nelson Mandela coming in Southern Africa. All of the Southern African economies started looking at how to reorganize tourism, which had been a safari kind of tourism, which was very exploitative, white hunters coming in, and I'm not condemning hunting, but more just the type of economy that it represented, which was just very unconscious tourism. And they converted that into conscious tourism with the creation of value-added conservation economies, where they helped communities to gain what is really their own equity in the process. The fact was that before, these local communities had no ownership of the land, so they worked to make sure they had that equity in the land in these conservation trusts and were guaranteed a percentage of the returns. So that was achieved through public-private cooperation. The government did not do this alone. They worked with very responsible tour operators throughout the region in order to create guidance and guidelines for both communities and government to achieve what they now call a conservation economy that is dedicated to the protection of both their social and their natural assets. So all sustainable business really needs to invest in what I'm calling natural and social capital. And you have to look at this from the point of view of achieving it with business. Business cannot be an adversary to government. This is really a mistake in tourism, especially in tourism, because public-private cooperation without question, especially with the impetus of the responsible tourism community, can create the mechanism to achieve this beautiful balance between natural social capital that we're saying now is at the basis of all of the growth of tourism. So this new paradigm that I'm really trying to discuss, get input from all of you on, looking forward to hearing all of the upcoming case studies, which for me are always a revelation. How are we going to now create these experiences and include the cost of preserving these places in the process? So we have to include the cost to manage human health and local well-being. We have to include the cost to manage common pool resources. And of course, we have to be thinking seriously about the impact of climate change on our tourism products around the world and how we can insure them, really, indemnify them if possible, help them to prepare now for coming impacts. This is no easy process. We need to collaborate and we need to work together now. I consider it an emergency around the world. We are facing a global emergency, which is now called over-tourism. You've probably been reading this, but there's only one way to prepare, in my opinion, that is coming up with new formulas to incorporate the cost of protecting our destinations together with what the traveler pays. Now, I gave this lecture once at Cornell University, and the school paper made the headline, "Epler recommends higher costs for travel." Actually, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that actually we have an economy that's already so vibrant, it is growing so rapidly. What we have to do is build in the cost of protecting these destinations. Now, that can come partly from the government revenue that's actually already generated, but just not saying, let's put this all towards marketing, but rather put it towards protection. So on the ground, for all of you that are from the destinations, you are my focus. I'm dedicating the rest of my career to this question, which is the essential nature of destination planning. Had a couple of chats already last night about it. How are we going to create a way for destinations to meet these goals? So this is my checklist, and it includes, as you can see, everything from including ecological services to infrastructure assessment to looking at the social and environmental factors that make our tourism so vibrant to ultimately coming up with a way to pay for that infrastructure I mentioned. One of the great cases that I rely on in my teaching is this case, which I'd be happy to share a link to. It's from Thailand. It was done by our university at Berkeley in the United States, and it looked at the amount of revenue that would be required to actually cover the cost of the infrastructure for tourists. There you go. So one of the things I like to recommend now that I'm in the university world is that we need harmonized data. The whole big data world out there is ripe for the taking for this problem. And most of the focus in tourism has really been on how do we collect consumer data. That's very important for marketing. But I'm talking about data that will help us to understand the problems that we're facing. So what I like to say is that we need a moonshot approach, which engages the technical support of universities using global IT systems, GIS, software, to make it feasible for us as a global community to begin to build data around where these problems lie and how to address them. One of the ways that I've been enamored of, which came to me via my institution at Harvard through the Graduate School of Design, is called the Geo Design Hub. We are teaching our first course right now online on this topic, having students from all over the world get together on what is called the Geo Design Hub and look at just one destination. And how can we manage all this data? The problem with big data, as you probably know, is that you have to be a genius to understand it unless it's interpreted for you in a way that makes it real. And one of the problems with tourism, especially at the destination level, is that people have trouble understanding how to properly use data in a way that will help to make them make really good decisions, especially when you're talking about growth. This kind of data that uses maps enables destinations to visualize what will happen. It does visual projections. So that, let's say you take one issue, sea level rise from climate change. Let's just say you're building on the coast. Don't you want to know what the projections are for sea level rise? My students will be able to, any student who takes a class in this, will be able to project that easily as part of a 3-month course. So what we're saying is, of the dozens of factors that need consideration as we build up on the environmental and cultural and social side, we can now use this kind of software to look at ecological basis of our development, look at infrastructure analysis, and then create what is called the multi-criteria plan analysis. It isn't actually as technocratic as it used to be. What the Harvard folks have done, and they were involved with the invention of GIS that have created this new tool, is to make it easy to use. That was their goal. And it is easy to use. So the point is that anybody in the world could access this. So what our goal is at Harvard is to foster better decision making in the pathway towards creating a process where the key stakeholders, the destinations, are involved in the process, that there is not a top-down decision-making process, but rather an inclusive decision-making process where local people have access to these tools. They can visualize data and they can anticipate the future with the growth of tourism and make good decisions now. So I hope you all have enjoyed the opportunity to hear a little bit about the research that we're doing and how it applies to the growth of tourism in your region, because we believe that destinations are at the basis of every aspect of our tourism offering. And if we allow them to be degraded by too much tourism, we're going to lose the fundamental asset that we're selling. So we want to establish the value of what we call those common pool resources before it's too late. Because as we all know, the world is moving towards a service economy where everyone is just depending on everyone else's service. So if you don't put money in the actual asset and protect it, you're going to lose it. And you have to set a price that's appropriate to its use. And then you have to bring all your citizens up to speed, because as we all know, this is a political process, and we all have to agree on it. And then we need to create what I call the rules of engagement, not based on what the industry needs or it's what the citizens need, right? They deserve a beautiful place to live that hasn't been degraded by tourism. And there is so much money, we're talking trillions of dollars that are flowing through our economy that could be actually partially, and I'm talking a small percentage, dedicated to better livelihoods at the local level. And so, what do we need to do? Invest. Invest in national resources and infrastructure in order to create a genuinely healthy well-being for local people around the world. So thank you all so much for this opportunity, and I'm sure there'll be time for questions afterwards. Thank you.